Hello, welcome to the channel and thanks for watching. It's finally time to paint the characters for my Horus Heresy Death Guard. The army is nearly finished, so we're painting the chaplain consul and the cataphractii praetor. Now this is an interesting video because I made a few mistakes here that actually turned out to benefit me, so we'll talk about those shortly. Mistake number one was how I undercoated, so I airbrushed them black and then I airbrushed them aluminium. I've been airbrushing or undercoating the rest of the models in gunmetal, so it's a much brighter silver, but it works out well in the end. The other mistake I made, you can see here I'm correcting, is I left a mould line down the armour panel on this Terminator and I don't know how I missed it. I could have left it, but it would have bugged me forever because you'd have seen it. So I just took the decision to back a step and fix that mistake, scrape the mould line off, and you can see in the background there I've painted it black and let that dry and then paint with the silver over the top. Now, starting off, this is a much brighter silver, but I'm following the same techniques as I have done on my other videos with the rest of the Death Guard, so check those out if you want to. Starting off with that off-white colour, that Rakkar flesh onto the metal. Now you notice here though, I'm doing the same thing I've done on other videos where I leave a little bit of the metal showing through or around the rivets, that kind of thing, to look like battle damage, but I'm having to go over and do 2 or 3 very thin coats onto this because this silver is much brighter than previous. I do want it to look a little bit cleaner as well, so I'm probably leaving a little bit less battle damage than I normally would do. Now onto the brass areas, so this is the Retributor Armour onto the bronze sort of lining of the panels. Now with the Terminator, I've done that on all of the kind of panel linings and things to make him look arcane, archaic. With the chaplain now, I've only focused on detail parts, so around his crozius, some of the skulls, the end of his gun, that kind of thing, because I want them to look similar, but I don't want the characters to look identical. So with the chaplain, I've left the kind of silver lining on the armour, and because it's again a brighter silver, it really does stand out differently, but they do look similar. Now, picking up the red that I've used on the rest of the Death Guard army onto the robes and cloaks, so it's quite a quick, easy, just solid layer. Then using a nice flat earth colour to represent the leather on the strapping on the Terminator. Now again, this much brighter undercoat means I'm having to do 2 or even 3 coats because the paint is thinned down on a wet palette, so it's 2 or 3 coats to get it going properly thick. Disadvantage of undercoating in a bright silver, but we'll talk about some of the advantages later. I'm doing some black detailing just onto the casings of the guns, again to tie it into the rest of the army that I've done, and then onto the panels and things on the back where the cables kind of run through. A little drop of yellow into the eyes of the chaplain. Obviously the Terminator's bareheaded, we'll look at that in a second. If you notice, I haven't done the visor on the face mask of the chaplain because I couldn't decide where to put the green on these models, which is why I'm leaving it till last. And I left the visor because I thought that's the one place I am determined it's going to go. A little bit of blue into the plasma coils of the chaplain there, and just a flat flesh colour onto the Terminator's head. I don't go into huge degrees of painting on the flesh in this guide. It's probably something that I do avoid a little bit, but this simple technique sort of works well. Now on to, I suppose, the most important part, the Death Guard green. How am I picking that out in the models? So I'm doing the face visor, you can see here on the chaplain model, and I really genuinely couldn't decide where to put the green, because on the normal Marines it's on the shoulder pads. Simply decided with the chaplain to put a stripe up the middle of his chest plate, just to have a couple of pops of that green coming through. And then on the Terminator praetor, just onto the shields that are on the model there. Now I don't do any massive detail on the shields, I am kind of saving that for later. I might drop some transfers on, I haven't quite decided. Now again, you see me here doing 2 layers of this Death Guard green. If you watch my other videos, I don't necessarily leave it to dry and then come back to do a second layer. I've kind of had to on this again, mention it again. A very bright kind of silver undercoat has then meant, you've got to put some extra layers on there to get a similar tone. If I just put 1 layer on, it would probably be a bit too bright and vibrant, potentially. So you can see there, I'm not going to talk about how I do the bases, that's on another video, so you can check that one out, but just doing the bases and then get into the game wash stage. So this is a Vallejo sepia game wash over the whole model to kind of dirty it down, dull it down, and it'll bring all those shadows into the gaps of the armour. Now you might not be able to notice this on the video, but at this stage normally the models are quite a lot darker than this, because again, normally started off with a slightly darker metallic undercoat. So the next stages, they're exactly the same. If you've watched my other videos, you'll see we're trying to bring the colour back to the model. So the same paint we've already used, going over the same areas. You see here I am covering the panels. This is with relatively watered down paints. It's been on, again, on a wet palette. If you don't use a wet palette, you need to just make sure you've got some water in there, because you're trying to put almost a glaze onto these panels here to cover the armour. You can see the amount of time I'm spending on these panels just kind of sped up. So we're not going into the gaps and cracks of the armour. You want to leave the shade in there, that wash that you've done, so that you'll get lots of multi-toned effects kind of across the model. You can see here just working on the armour panel around there with a much smaller brush because I don't want to catch any of the kind of green areas, and you can see some of that kind of detail there. Now, it's now exactly the same with the rest of the colours we've already used. I will use some additional colours to put some extra effects on, but it's going over the whole model with the same colours you already used. You see here the green, moving on to the reds, and the same principle, you're putting it on to the raised areas. Now I'm leaving in the cloak, you can see a lot of that wash in the cracks and the deep cracks of that cloak, because you know it's more of a flowing material. On the armour, we've only left it into the armour gap, so there's not quite as much of that wash showing. An interesting point for you though to think about when I worked on the armour, I didn't go into the joints kind of in between the leg and the hip and all those kind of things at all. I left that just with the wash over onto those metallics. Same thing on the leather here, just some detail onto there, and you can hopefully see the levels building up on the model as we're going through. One interesting point is I'm going to do metal in a minute, but I don't actually touch any of the stripping and banding on these models because I think the wash has worked really, really well with the vibrancy of that initial base coat. Now, this is the first new colour we're using onto this secondary stage. This is using a bone white colour just to go onto the scrolls that the chaplain's got on his leg there, and working on his kind of crozius piece. Just some very gentle edge highlighting here, really onto the raised areas. It's almost ridged the kind of wings of this crozius, so just onto those raised areas, leaving lots of nice shadow and wash in there. Now, sometimes you might want to then go up to another layer, maybe use a white or something as a final edge highlight, but I don't think it's needed. Now, I talked about flesh. I've been very lazy doing the flesh on this one model here, just using that flat flesh colour over the top. But what I do, which I don't actually manage to film, is just put a little bit of the red around his lip areas and into some of those gaps, but I didn't film that, so you could just do it with that flat flesh and it would be absolutely fine. That's his final details, so working on a little bit of black, a little bit of blue into the plasma coils there, and we're almost at kind of finishing stages. So simple, easy techniques I think look quite effective. The last stage really is to go into the bolts and the rivets and things that are across the model, and I've gone for a gunmetal colour, which is a darker colour, more like I normally do the undercoating on this Death Guard army if you watch those other videos. So this is going onto the rivets and studs across the chaplain and onto the Terminator, because I wanted the studs on the leather to be that kind of silvery colour. So advantage is disadvantage of the mistake I made at the very beginning using the more of a bright aluminium undercoat. Well, if you look at the knees of the chaplain now, it almost looks like I've already highlighted those areas because it was much more of a vibrant, bright metallic colour. The wash that's gone over the top has given it some real nice tones and almost made it pop that little bit more, so I don't feel the need to go over and relayer that. And I'd say the same on the Terminator. You know, that brass really does stand out much more vibrantly than the normal Marines. Now I'll do a video once I've finished the army showcasing it all to have a look, so I will explain and show you the differences a little bit more, but they're going to blend in really nicely with the army, but they're almost a bit cleaner than the normal Marines, which I suppose makes sense because these are characters, maybe their armour's better or whatever. So an accident, but a happy accident in the end, as how it's looked. So that's just finalising, finishing the basing off with some sort of burnt grass tufts onto it to make it blend in with the rest of the army. Again, I haven't shown how I've painted the bases because again, this would make the video even longer. And there we are onto the finished models. I am really happy with them. Again, a couple of mistakes. We rectified the mould error. We've actually benefited from the undercoat mistake. Really happy with it. Look, and if you like the video, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz, and I'll see you on another one.